Welcome to Ancestral Health Today, evolutionary insights into modern health.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of Ancestral Health Today. And today we're honored to have Anya Kaats. Anya, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So happy to finally be doing this.
Wonderful. Yeah, so grateful to finally have you. I know it's been a few back and forth with schedules. So I like to have our guests, introduce themselves at length and tell the audience who you are, where you come from, and what's your history in the ancestral health movement.
Oh, long story. So I guess honestly, I could probably track it all back to being a kid. My mom, I grew up in just outside of New York City, and my mom was tuned into and keyed into, organic foods and homeopathic medicine and, cooking whole healthy foods. And that was a big part of our reality growing up. I remember being sort of like the weird kid with the home packed lunch and like a rice milk because I didn't have what all the other kids were having. And so of course as a child that was like frustrating because I wanted to eat at McDonald's or whatever. And in retrospect, I think that was like a very sort of important education in alternative ways of eating that were outside of the mainstream. And I guess the other thing that was happening to me as a kid is that I had quite severe digestive issues, which at the time, I had like severe colic as a baby. And back then there wasn't any kind of awareness around the connection between that and gut health. I was born, my mom had a C-section, was a vegetarian for the entire time that she was pregnant with me, and didn't start eating meat until after I was born. And so I grew up with all these health issues, pretty severe digestive issues to the point where they just sort of became normal in my life, up until I was about 20. Just getting into the nitty gritty right away, but just like severe constipation, which I just accepted as like a part of my reality.
Like a lot of people do nowadays. It seems like gut issues are just ubiquitous and everybody seems to think it's just the norm.
Yeah, that was truly like my reality since I was a child. So there wasn't even any experience of anything else. I guess in my late teens, I had sort of like evolved into a standard American diet. Once I was free of my mother's influence and I was in college and I didn't really know how to cook very well. And so I sort of just ate whatever. I mean, I wasn't like pounding fast food or anything, but there was definitely like a lot of processed carbohydrates and juice and lots of toast and like, the kind of low fat idea or something, like unintentionally. That was what I was consuming. And I had a close friend growing up who was really into nutrition and health and had sort of tried a bunch of different diets herself. And we sort of both bonded around our sort of health issues over the years. And I came across a movie called Fathead. It's a documentary this guy created. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was a while ago, right? Like this was like back in the day, like when, Mark Sisson was like just beginning and was like the only, like him and Rob Wolf or something were the only paleo people in the space. And that was really my first introduction to this concept of like that maybe this thing that we've been fed around calories without a distinction between fat and carbohydrates. Like the whole thing was just really fascinating to me. And I sent it to this friend of mine who I kind of trusted around these things. And she's like, yeah, that's pretty legit. And that propelled me down a rabbit hole, not because I was trying to solve my health problems, but just because it was compelling to me, like, and so I sort of stumbled around across the whole paleo primal world, and again, it resonated. It was like, oh, of course we're supposed to be like moving naturally. Of course we're supposed to be eating whole foods. Of course, like it all seemed such common sense. And so I like bought my Vibrant Five Fingers and, just like dove full into paleo. And at the same time that I was experimenting with paleo, I was also going through a really big life transition, sort of ending a relationship, graduating high school, going into college. I tend to make these big health changes like at important transitional times in my life, which makes it sometimes difficult to distinguish like what changed. Was it that I started eating differently, right? Or just because my life is better. But at the time I wasn't thinking that in depth. So I changed my life, and ultimately over time, like the health stuff came back to some degree, and I started getting, and I had also gone off birth control, hormonal birth control around the exact same time. So changed my life, changed my entire diet, and went off hormonal birth control, which I'd been on since I was 16. Without nobody guided me in that process. Nobody said like, oh, by the way, if you do this, you should support your hormones. I mean, so I just cold turkey went off. Again, like all the stress and everything that was going on in my life. And the first weird thing that happened was that I started to get recurring styes in my eye, back and forth and over and over again. And then that sort of developed into acne. And so over the course of like 2 or so years in my early 20s, this diet, which I thought was sort of helping me be healthy, I wasn't seeing those effects anymore. And I equated my lack of health to not doing the diet well enough, not doing the thing, well enough. And so I ultimately started to get even more strict about what I was eating, from like very strict paleo to like, but I was eating dairy, and like, okay, maybe not dairy. And maybe once in a while I'd have like a cheat day with a pizza, but it was like no more gluten at all. And again, simultaneous to this, I started working full-time in the natural products industry, basically straight out of college. It wasn't necessarily the plan, but
And where did you go to college?
Sarah Lawrence.
Okay. So in the US, I thought you had gone overseas at some point.
I went abroad and spent a year in Amsterdam as well.
Okay.
So what was I saying?
So you started working in the natural products, health industry out of college.
Yeah. So I was working at Whole Foods part-time, which then like within a matter of a couple of months turned into a demo specialist position where I would cook food for the customers to sample. And some of those were like sort of paid for by the brands that were sold in Whole Foods. But a good portion of it was just me deciding what I wanted to do, which was quite fun. And I had no professional cooking experience, but I knew how to like make date balls or whatever. That was my like audition for the position. And so I was, my whole life sort of started getting consumed by this. Through Whole Foods, through the demo specialist position, I ended up being hired by a kale chip company to run what at the time was just a team of demo people. So hiring people nationwide to sample, which I don't even think happens anymore in Whole Foods, all that sampling. But
it still does occasionally. Yeah. Since 2020, a lot less than it used to.
Right, that makes sense.
I still go in there sometimes, and there's one person. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was like my entire job was like managing all of those demos for brands coming in, doing demos myself. Like it was such a huge part of the store at that time. Anyway, I met a bunch of brands through that position, and I ended up being hired by this kale chip company, Brad's Raw Foods, to run and create a demo team, which then evolved into like social media and digital marketing. And the brand grew and grew and grew and got quite a bit larger than it was when I was first hired. It was like on the Today Show, and like this got crazy. And so through the course of my 20s, like as I'm, going through my own personal stuff, I started working at Broad's, and then I moved across the country to work at another natural product startup called Mama Chia. And then from there was hired to work at a company called Suja, which is, I guess, still pretty popular. And then after that, for several years, was just consulting for brands, doing creative marketing, a lot of product and food photography. So that was my entire life professionally. And also I started a health and wellness blog during this time. So, but yet, while this was all going on, as I was working in the natural product, the wellness industry, as I was making paleo muffins. And I also sometime during this whole journey became a holistic health coach as well. Went through the training on that, which was mostly...
You really did it all.
Oh yeah, I did the whole wellness influencer shebang in that era. Was definitely what I was going for. And meanwhile, like while I had this public facing health food blog and health and wellness blog, and while I was, working in this industry and promoting raw juice or kale chips or whatever it was to the general public, I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker over the course of my 20s. And so this acne that had, the styes that turned to acne that had developed in my early 20s had never gone away, and in fact gotten worse. And the gut issues were, like not horrific, but not good. And I continued to feel as though if I got my diet more together or got my lifestyle and my workouts more together, that would equal health, and was pretty obsessed with trying to find a solution to that. How do I fix this? Like, what is it that I'm, and sort of going through, I must have taken, every supplement, I just went through and I just bought every product in every store that anybody wanted to sell me to try and heal myself. And yeah, nothing worked. And the acne piece got quite bad, to where it was sort of affecting my psychology. I'd never had acne as a teenager. I'd never had, there was just nothing like that. So I felt really resentful that was happening to me in my adult life. Didn't I, move past this? And just that sort of really, just so much frustration and self, frustration at the self that I couldn't fix myself, does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, it does. And in that time as a coach, what were you doing with clients, and what type of success were you seeing with your own clients?
Yeah, I actually never really saw clients. I got that health coaching certification mainly just for my own personal growth. That was kind of the intention behind it. And I had just moved to California at the time, and my ex-husband, I don't even think we were engaged by then, had not moved out to California yet. And I had a lot of time on my hands, so I was just working out and doing all this stuff, and just that was my project during that time.
I wanted to, before you move on, backtrack a little to your year overseas.
Yeah.
Did you see any changes during that year that you were in Amsterdam?
Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting year. And I'm sort of like unsure on the timing of when the paleo thing really started, but I feel like I hadn't really gotten full into it in Amsterdam. So when I went there, I was like going to the gym pretty regularly. I remember I was eating oatmeal. Like a lot of my health problems got better, and those were the things that I sort of remember doing. It wasn't diet at the time. It was still what I thought were sort of like whole foods, a lot of like brown rice and chicken and oatmeal. And yes, my health problems did get a lot better that year, which I'm sure was due to a variety of factors. I remember like noticing that it got better, going back home, and then noticing that it got worse again. And I sort of equated that to my lifestyle over there. I was just like really happy and doing what I wanted to be doing. And going to the gym and being active and not being obsessive about food, like just eating, So yeah, I didn't even think about at the time, like the quality of food there versus the US, which I'm sure also had a big role. And also I had the sort of, as the story goes, what came to me was really how difficult my childhood was in many ways, super stressful and anxiety ridden. And a lot of that was due to a difficult relationship I had with my mother. And Amsterdam, when I went abroad, was the first time I had sort of, as a person, aside from like sleepaway camp, I guess, spent a chunk of time away from my parents. And so I think that was a really big factor as well. But my health stuff, like, because it was just the digestive thing, which I was so used to at the time, like I wasn't really thinking a lot about health until those years where I like discovered paleo, went off birth control, ended a relationship, graduated high school, like all of these things.
So you were talking about you moved to California, your then husband wasn't even there yet.
Right. So I was taking this health coaching program, which was IIN, Institute for Integrative Nutrition. And I thought that was a great program. I mean, because it was really not dogmatic around how to coach people and was quite nuanced in saying, like, here's all the diets and something different's going to work for everybody. And I
did the same one for my own personal understanding. And this was, I think the program was like a year old at the time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. And that's really what influenced me to start the blog, which at the time when I first started it was quite a lot about, like being happy and being outside and that sort of thing that IIN calls primary food, right? Spirituality and friends and community, and that all of these pieces need to be checked off before we can really think about what kind of diet is going to fix your life or your health. And so I feel like I really started on a good page there. But as time went on, so many different things happened. I think my like the health stuff was getting worse. So I thought, oh shit, I'm not doing enough. So does that all make sense so far?
Yes,
like
absolutely.
I'm talking a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it was just a really it was a rough decade for me in my 20s with all of that. And then again, it's sort of, it would like kind of get better, but then get bad again and kind of get better. And I could never 100% correlate like, oh, when I eat gluten, I have this flare. it wasn't like that. It was so random that it sort of made it impossible to settle on anything. And so I was just constantly obsessed with, what if it's this? What if it's that? What if I can try this supplement? What if I can try that supplement? And yeah, this sort of moderate fluctuation in symptoms, but generally just pretty terrible all the time, especially as I got into my late 20s. And then I again initiated a change in my life quite drastically and decided to get divorced, and was sort of, my ex-husband and I couldn't figure out the house situation, and so I was forced to leave my house. And just coincidentally, because this is how my life works, at the same time I had already sort of signed on to do a parasite detox protocol and like a bacterial detox through a naturopathic doctor that I had gotten to know over the years. And this was the latest and greatest strategy for eliminating what really actually at the time when I got divorced was I was in a good phase, like sort of minimal, but it wasn't good enough. And so I had signed on to do these protocols truly at the same time. And so I get divorced, I leave my home, and I start taking, supplements and biocidin, I think it was called, that like strips your gut lining. And of course, being like my personality is just like, well, if you're going to do something, do it all the way. And like, I can handle it. And so I did, the most extreme level of this detox that I could, as far as, taking more supplements or like doing coffee enemas. And anyway, so what ended up happening is not that my symptoms and acne got better, but that they got horrifically worse in the course of a month. Went from like pretty fine, like had I known where it was going, I would have just stayed where I was, to worse than it had ever been in those 10 or so years that I'd been struggling with this, which was pretty horrifying. And yeah, like catapulted me even further into just this despair of like, why isn't it working? Why can't I figure this out? And yeah, that continued for about, I finally had the wherewithal to stop the parasite detox protocol. And I also, around that time, finally, like the same doctor ordered a hormonal test, which nobody had ever done. I mean, I had been to many naturopathic doctors and many regular doctors, and nobody had given me a hormonal test, which was quite shocking after it finally happened and I learned about all of this. And that hormonal test, so like, I don't know, let's say 6 months or so after I got divorced, was so bad it showed that my, was it progesterone? One of these, or estrogen, was so low that it was like, it didn't even show up on the chart. There was like a, like, I don't know, like a speed limit dial or whatever. And it was so low. It was like at a post-menopausal level. So like really, really bad. And I had done so much research kind of by the point where I was like, I really need to test my hormones, that I could recognize that was probably the root of a lot of this, at least on a physiological level, because, the hormonal stuff affects everything. The gut, just like it's a domino effect. So, which didn't necessarily explain my digestive issues growing up, aside from the stress level, which of course also affects hormones. But anyway, at least in my adult life, it became pretty clear to me after I took this test that was a big problem. I started taking bioidentical hormones, And that helped a good bit. It took me out of like crisis mode into sort of not great, but acceptable mode. Still taking a lot of supplements. And also, so over the course of the next 2 years after I got divorced, it was a really dark time for me. I basically locked myself in a cabin in Topanga, California for 2 years. And for that first year, really saw almost nobody because I was just so ashamed of my skin and so uncomfortable and so freaked out, and going to therapy 2 to 3 times a week, and really uncovering a lot around my relationship with my mother growing up, my childhood, like just so much stuff that was staring me in the face in a way. I'd been to tons of therapy before, but it never really seemed to, it didn't really work until this period in my life. And I was really starting to slowly, but make some pretty clear connections between my psychology and my health. So I could tell that things were getting better, and then I would get back in touch with like a toxic person, but not change anything about my diet or my supplement taking or whatever, and the problem would get really bad again. And so but very begrudgingly, I mean, because I had spent almost a decade fighting against this, but ultimately accepted that the health issues that I was having, they were trying to tell me something, like that I should be grateful for what was happening, for, like that my body was an ally and trying to alert me to something that was wrong. And having this kind of epiphany around like, well, when my health problems go away, that will mean that I no longer need them to alert me to something that's not right. And there was a lot not right about my life prior to that. The marriage that I was in was not where I wanted to be. It wasn't a good relationship. We weren't compatible. I was super stressed and working way too hard at work and punishing myself for not being able to figure out my health, and working for these huge natural products brands, and so stressed out, and crazy bosses, and commuting to work, and like having this really unhealthy relationship with my mother, which then translated into my life. I mean, I was like not in a good place.
So a combination of stress, which has implications for actually, biological cascades. And then you have more and more restrictive diet, and you have hormonal dysregulation, and all of that is converging at the same time.
Yeah, I was pretty much doing everything opposite of what I should have been doing, which started, I would say, especially that moment of stopping birth control. I mean, I should have been nourishing myself, and even taking specific supplements to sort of help my body rebuild its hormonal capacities. And instead of doing that, I restricted my diet, like you said. I started working out harder, and even though it was paleo focused, it was excessive. And I was in this really stressful time in my life. So it was across the board. As the problems got worse, I did what the wellness industry told me I needed to do in order to be healthier. And none of it worked. And the one missing piece was, are you happy? So anyway, that is basically the backstory. And I'll let you inquire further, but once I started accepting what was happening to me as an allyship and something I should respect and listen to, And once I started changing my life in positive ways that were more authentic and reflective of who I really was and what I really wanted in life, um, ultimately I made another kind of brash decision, which are my favorite kind of decisions, to just, I was still taking these supplements and the hormones, and things were a lot better, but still not great. And as I started picking up the supplement container again and again and again, I felt this just undeniable nausea reaction to it. And I kind of made the decision of like, if I'm just going to have like kind of crappy skin for the rest of my life, I'd rather eat whatever I want and stop taking these supplements, because it doesn't really seem to be making a difference whether I do it or not do it. It's just like, this is how my skin is going to be forever. And so I just impulsively decided to stop everything. I threw all my supplements away. I stopped taking the bioidentical hormones and radically changed my life. And within a year, all of my health problems disappeared.
Because you were doing diet more restrictive and just not necessarily having specific targets for the supplements, and you're doing this at the exclusion of everything else. So community, which we know is incredibly important, and just that emotional stability and, and all of the other pillars that come with it that can be integrated. But I see it as a repeating story, even though, food is such an important part because nutrients, build the blocks that go into what our body is. But it's not the only story. And so many people, just are absolutely hyper focused on that area at the exclusion of everything else, and creating even more stress because of the food factor.
Right. And I think that's seen as, I think we do that consistently because it's the easier option. It's the option we feel we have control over, right? Like, I don't need to reassess my entire life and relationships and job and community, right? I can just take this supplement and the problem will go away. And it's really unfortunate because it's ironic to me that I really do think I had great intentions, and I've sort of returned back in a cycle to so many of these principles that I learned through IIN or through, the early days of the paleo world and going to like the first couple of years of Paleo FX and all of that, where there was, talk about environmentalism. And I just feel like I kind of got caught in an eddy floating down the river where, like, on so many levels, on the one hand, like, well, I can't make money on the blog from talking about climbing a tree, so I might as well do a sponsored post for, an almond flour company. And then the sort of personal spiral of like, oh, that person's healthier than me and I'm not where I want to be, and I better do this thing, do that thing. And so it's like I don't even blame the ancestral health movement or anything like that. Like, I think there's just this comprehensive way in which we get distracted from what really matters, and instead have our attention pointed at like, what's the latest supplement or biohack or this controllable, easy fix solution to what I think is a far more broad problem in our society and culture. And so, like, the food is super important. I, live in the middle of nowhere in Colorado now, and really, spend a lot of time prioritizing local foods and organic foods, or at least, foods that are from the local garden or whatever. And so those things are important. But if I was doing all of that and not living the life I wanted to lead, then I don't think that makes a huge difference. And there was a really great post by Chris Kresser many years ago, or a podcast episode, where he talked about a client, a patient of his, a guy who had really severe digestive issues. And it sounded very similar to my story, like was just really, really, really sick and had tried everything to the point where he was essentially eating no foods, just an extremely limited diet. And sort of in a, place of total surrender and giving up, went into Chris's office and just said, like, if I'm going to be this sick, like I might as well, and I'm like dying, I might as well enjoy myself and enjoy my life. And he went out and he started eating pizza and beer and whatever he wanted. And his digestive issues improved. And he went back to Chris Kresser and told him this. And that's phenomenal. Like, to me, that's akin to some kind of like magic cure for something. And yes, it requires like some deep insights around how we engage with ourselves and how we're living our lives. But I think it's a huge piece that we really do a disservice to many people on not focusing on that for whatever reason, because it's difficult, because we can't sell products around it, or,
Yeah. And there's a lot of physiological explanation. There's the gut-brain connection, right? And we have neurons in the gut, and there's bacteria that produce neurotransmitters and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, we can also obsess about those details and trying to control it from that perspective, right? Rather than looking at the entire picture again. So fast forward to where you are today. How is it different, and how did you get there?
Man, everything is different. It's so funny to look back at myself in those days of the health food blogger self, because I just I feel like not just in weight or quality of skin or anything, but I just look so much different. I think the way that health affects us, it's so comprehensive as far as just like our entire way of being in the world. And so I currently, I said, I live in the middle of nowhere. We have no restaurants really out here. We have like one cafe that makes breakfast and lunch that we eat at very occasionally. But other than that, it's like we're pretty much on our own to cook. So we cook at home essentially every meal. I would say 95% of what we eat is cooked at home. And a lot of it is local. We buy half a cow from a local grass-fed beef ranch that's this group of cattle has ancestrally been on this land since the late 1800s. So it's like as local can be. And in the summer I volunteer at 2 community gardens, and a lot of our produce comes from there. And yeah, just trying to eat as local and clean as possible. However, I'm not paleo anymore. I eat, there are some things I just don't like, but I bake my own bread, and I, occasionally make cookies with real flour and not almond flour. And I don't drink. But yeah, I'm generally pretty relaxed about food. I went through this whole sort of like process in my late 20s where I had learned how to cook quite well because of the blog, and I was doing food photography, and I'd really, figured some stuff out, but I'd never cooked like a normal person. I'd never used flour. I'd never, used regular sugar. Like everything that I made was with coconut nectar, coconut sugar, almond flour, cassava flour. Like I truly had never cooked normal food that I could, pick up a cookbook and make something like that was in my life. And so I sort of had
the pictures of the focaccia you made are just Make you drool.
I know. I've been thinking about that focaccia. I haven't made that in a while, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I really want to make it again. So yeah, I kind of had this like, renaissance of cooking, of like, wow, I can just make a brownie recipe. And I think over the course of the last, it's been 6 years, 5-6 years since these epiphanies around lifestyle and health and the connection between psychology and physiology. I've allowed my intuition to inform me about what works and what doesn't. I allow my body to inform me about what works and what doesn't. I guess it's become pretty clear to me that I don't enjoy alcohol, really. That was like an intuitive, felt decision, not something I did because I, felt like I needed to be healthier. And so just there are these different ways that like discoveries get made around, like, I think our bodies are extremely intelligent, and through this kind of like biohacking, supplement taking world, that we've lost that intuitive connection to what our bodies know. So it's been a long process, and of course not just physically, physiologically, but also psychologically, being more in tune with my intuition around like, what do I want in life? What feels good? What doesn't? Like, where am I overstepping when it comes to work? Or what do I even want to be doing for work? And asking these sort of bigger questions. So yeah, I've developed a unique lifestyle and diet for me that feels good for me. And I don't adhere to any kind of labeled way of being. Although I recently started thinking I really am averse to labels in general across the board. I just find them to be suffocating and not life affirming. And so I was trying to think for myself though, like, well, if I could develop a label myself, like, what is it that I'm emulating, or like, what is it that my life is an example of? What resonates for me across the board, when it comes to diet, lifestyle, sexuality, relationships, like, and I feel like the thing that applies to all of it is just like trying to live as close to a sort of hunter-gatherer tribal life as possible, right? So like, what are those components? Like healthy local food, community, clean air, clean water, like mutual support, right? There are all these different levels at which I feel like humans are meant to relate to one another. And I think those are, similar to the sort of quote unquote primary food elements from IIN, these ideas of friendship and community and spirituality. And there are all these really fundamental pieces of health and wellness that I prioritize above and beyond, what kind of flour is in my cookie now. And same with, we haven't talked about exercise as well, but same there, like doing things that my body really enjoys. Like I really love to dance, and I really love Ashtanga yoga, and I really love moving rocks around the yard. And, there are these activities that I actually find fun and enjoyable, and I pursue those. And I don't worry about, how many burpees I'm doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even though, you're drawing away from the label, I'm glad that you said that, because when I look at your lifestyle, that's what, comes to mind. Obviously, we don't have, a lot of us don't have the opportunity to just, go in the woods and disconnect totally, because that's not participating in our society. But you've done as much of that as, can possibly be done for you. So how did you transition into where you are now?
In what way?
Just a timeline. What made you decide to move to the middle of nowhere, Colorado? Was there a step process? What did you do in between?
Yeah. So yeah, after I got divorced, I was living in Topanga, as I mentioned, for a couple of years. And that was I feel super grateful to have found the place that I found there. It was in the middle of nature. I mean, LA was not the greatest, was not really a fan, but I didn't leave my house very much and I got my groceries delivered. I just stayed basically in the woods as much as possible. And I went on a lot of solo road trips, camping by myself, sort of across the West. And at some point, I had to move to San Diego initially because of this job that I had in the natural products industry. And then I got another job in San Diego, but then I was working for myself, but I was still living in San Diego and owned a house there. So there was really, if I was no longer married and no longer owned that house, there was nothing else keeping me in San Diego, let alone California. But I moved to Topanga. It was close. It made sense for various reasons at the time, but I knew I wasn't going to stay there forever. And I was starting to I was thinking maybe I would go to grad school, which was something I always wanted to do, but never did. Go back to grad school or not go back, but go for the first time, go back to school. And I was sort of figuring out what I wanted to study. And I had this idea that maybe my grandparents had a cabin in Gunnison. When I say cabin, it was like, a very nice cabin in the middle of nowhere in Gunnison that they only spent summers. They spent summers there, but they were getting too old to even spend summers there. My grandmother needed oxygen. And
this
there
is
was
in
just
Colorado?
too much. Yeah, Gunnison, Colorado, sorry.
Okay.
And so I had this kind of idea of and I didn't want to sell it. I didn't have the money to buy it, but I thought, what if we could just postpone the selling of this property and I'll just live there and be the caretaker essentially and go to grad school and, continue to live alone in a little cabin in the woods. And, we really made this decision that this was going to happen and I was going to move forward with it. And then, and which was still not, my forever plan, but it was something that was going to get me to Colorado, which I had really decided was where I wanted to be. I'd also, during this time living in Topanga, took an astrology apprenticeship, and came to Colorado, the San Luis Valley, for a sort of a midterm meet each other in person retreat thing. And that area, which is where I live now, really struck me at the time as well. And so I just sort of started setting my sights on Colorado and anyway, and then I decided not to go to grad school and met my partner, Chris, and we sort of discovered within 5 minutes of meeting that we'd both been here to the San Luis Valley, to this town, Crestone. And both had this idea of maybe purchasing land here and kind of convincing all our friends to move out and create a kind of lifeboat together. And so we traveled for a little while, but ultimately bought some land here and a little over a year ago settled here full time. Finally bought it, not rented, but bought something. And so yeah, I mean, that's sort of just how I ended up here. And, Chris and I started spending time in Crestone mostly during COVID. And so we got to know the land really well. And it was a really great place to be during COVID because you could just go outside. And it's a very small area. The population's about 2,000. At the end of the road, 20 minutes off the main road. So you don't even drive through. It's far. And so we got to know the land really well, but didn't really get to experience the community very much. We didn't meet very many people at all. And then it wasn't until we moved here, November of 22, that we started to get involved in the local community. And, to my surprise, because I really thought like maybe nothing goes on in this town. It seems really sleepy and really empty. And then, moving through COVID and actually staying here and getting myself involved in things that I hadn't before, was sort of pleasantly surprised by how many other people were here with very similar intentions, which was to live a simpler life, clean air, clean water, no building codes, like a police station's 45 minutes away, a sort of like self-policing, communally supportive, we call out the crazy people kind of a place. And, you kind of have to step up and get along with people and behave and say you're sorry, or just, live in total isolation. So the community feels amenable to the priorities that I feel like I've established for myself, which, are focused around the simple pleasures in life: good food, good people, good, climate, and support, and just really, we can't escape culture entirely. We're always going to be enveloped within that, but I think there are drastically different choices that can be made at all sort of different levels on how to kind of opt out of those systems, those cultural systems and expectations as much as possible.
As a woman, what would you say now to your younger self, and what would you not recommend? I don't like that word, but what would you say to a young woman or middle-aged woman who is seeking and it's lost in this lack of connection and community? And keep in mind that, there's many people at different levels. Some may have the resources to do what you did, but others, may be an impossibility, at least at the moment. What would you say to these women in order to find that community and look at the place that they're in from a more holistic perspective?
Yeah, I think a big word for me around all of this is nourishment, and that nothing good will come of like self-punishment and this sort of like self-restriction, that we should be prioritizing our nourishment in as many areas as we can, whether that's through food. And when I say nourishment, I don't mean like kale smoothies because that's healthy. I mean something that makes you feel, I don't know, for me a good example is like homemade chicken broth, something that's like you can feel and sense the nourishment in that. And, maybe sometimes that's a piece of homemade sourdough bread, like it can be whatever diet. It's about the process that went into that thing and what it represents, and, or taking a bath, or just like putting a hand on your chest and feeling a sense of compassion for ourselves. I think until we develop some degree of love for ourselves and forgiveness for all the ways we don't understand how to fix the problem, and this sort of self-compassion and self-compassion and forgiveness, I think, are huge. Before anything else happens, I think everything stems from there. And to recognize that really, truly none of this is our fault. It doesn't mean it's not our responsibility, but like, it's not our fault that we, grew up in a culture that disconnected us from our intuition, or it's not our fault that we were fed a crappy diet growing up and developed autoimmune conditions later in life. I mean, like, this is the reality. It's not anything, especially if this stuff started young, but even not, like, it's hard to figure this stuff out. It's hard to develop a new way of looking at it that sits outside of the cultural expectation or guidelines. So I think across the board it would be, having more compassion for ourselves, and that through that surrendering of like, okay, wow, yeah, this sucks. Like, what can I do from a place of like love and compassion to make some shifts here? And I can't say what that would be for everyone. I think it would be different. Maybe it's volunteering in a community. Maybe it's planting some seeds outside. Like there's so many different things that can nourish us. And so loving ourselves enough to do what we need for ourselves as best, to the best of our ability again. That would be my advice.
Yeah, that's well said. And that's a very important aspect. How about community? How does one go about building community or finding community wherever one is?
Yeah, that's a hard one too. I think, again, because our culture doesn't make it easy for us to do that. We live so close to each other. We're practically on top of each other, but we don't know each other. So I guess my personal strategy was really identifying what it was that truly interested me. And so beyond my job or my ex-husband's expectations or my parents' expectations, what was it that really lit me up? And after I got divorced, the first thing I really could connect to around that was like astrology. That resonated for me in a way that felt extremely nourishing and validating. And so I decided to enroll in this apprenticeship, in part just to meet people who I felt like might have similar values. And that worked. I did find a lot of people with similar values, and then sort of continued to pursue that, right? Like where would I go to meet people that cared about the earth and putting in the hard work to really connect with the earth? Like, well, I should go volunteer at a garden. So I just started to prioritize the things that were important to me in life. And through those, I met people I could see myself being in community with. I think that's what's really missing in finding community, is that we all live so close to each other, but that doesn't mean we're like, how do we meet people with similar values in a culture that's values don't match our own, especially, And so I think we have to sort of put in this extra effort to go engage in activities, art class or pottery class or dance class, or take a course or go on a trip, or, go somewhere where people like you might be. And through those activities, I think, is where we meet community. And then, that's what's most important. Like, yes, I would love all my friends to move here to Colorado and for us all to live on the same land and support each other. Like, that is the ideal, but that's not the only way that we can feel communally connected. I sort of despise social media and the internet in a variety of ways, but I wouldn't have found a community if it weren't for social media and my podcast that we didn't talk about, but that I had for many years, 4 or 5 years. That was also a way that I was connecting people with similar interests and similar values. And, that's how I met you. And we were able to foster that kind of, communal connection across WhatsApp chats and Discord servers and book club calls. And so there's ways to do it, even if you can't quit your job and move to the middle of nowhere. So yeah, I think that would be my very practical advice for finding people. Like, don't worry, you don't need to move to the middle of nowhere and like buy a tiny house or like do, what Instagram tells you. Those things are great, but also there's so much community to be found in different, innovative ways as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought the podcast, because that's a question I wanted to ask you and almost forgot, because I've seen you move through different things, and let go when it doesn't feel right for you anymore. So, and one of the things that we can, in my opinion, do, not wrong, that's not the right word, but fall for the additional traps, is in seeking community we fall into a bubble, right? And we go for more restrictions within that community and more isolation, and it becomes a dogmatic experience rather than a communal experience, and we
Yeah.
cling to those things. So what has led you to, let go of things that I've seen are amazing opportunities, or, in the middle of that thing thriving? What is it for you that makes you decide when it no longer feels aligned for you? And how can we avoid falling into the pitfalls of becoming dogmatic and becoming entrapped and falling into bubbles that are just another copy of what we had before in just a different format?
Right. Yeah, well, I think it all goes back to that sort of intuitive piece to we can't make those decisions for ourselves or figure out how to start something or end something if we're not connected to our own intuitive desires and our intuitive psychological health. And so I was not good at this for a long time. I worked myself into burnout, and made some really harmful choices around decisions and relationships and all of these things. So, yeah, I guess I've always approached things too as like not forever. I sort of stumbled into my career in the natural products industry. That was never the goal. It's not what I went to college for. It's not what I expected to be doing. And I also never really expected to be doing it forever. I got this job at Whole Foods. I wasn't going to be like, oh my God, I'm going to be the demo specialist for the rest of my life. It was, I'll just do this until the next thing comes along and change my mind and shift. So I think this understanding that, I think people can get pretty stuck in the process of making choices by thinking that the next thing you do is the thing you'll always be doing, and that you can't change or adapt or shift or go back or change your mind. And so I always sort of looked at these phases of my life as like steps somewhere. I don't know where the staircase is leading, but I'm just gonna like take the next step. And so I feel like that's given me some degree of relief as far as feeling like, you know what, I really don't want to be doing this anymore. I think we all know when we don't want to do something. Like that intuition doesn't really go away, right? We either feel desire and curiosity and we feel organically drawn, or we feel repulsed and we procrastinate and we avoid it. And so how to develop a relationship around that feeling and that moment of saying, I'm allowed to change my mind, or I'm allowed to walk away, or to decide I was wrong, or not even that I was wrong, but that it was right then and now it's wrong. So yeah, it feels, and as far as thriving, it's like, what rule, who says we have to stop something when it's collapsed? Why? Like, why can't something be successful? And then we can say, great, I did it. Like, that's what I wanted to do. I completed it. I don't need to continue to grow it, right? That's just like this capitalistic, I think, mindset that we have, that the thing must be completed to its pinnacle and we must scale and grow. And I feel like the podcast finished, like I did what I set out to do. It was a journey to figuring out what kind of life I wanted to live. And then I figured out what kind of life I wanted to live and started living that life. And so why would I spend my time talking about it when I could just be doing it? um, and I think a lot of people get stuck in the talking about it phase. Like, I think there's a lot of podcasts with a lot of experts that talk about these things that they haven't necessarily, they're not doing, they're just talking about them. So anyway, that a sidebar, but I feel like philosophy doesn't interest me unless it's applied. Like, I don't really want to talk about being communal. I'd like to try it. And those are two different things. So yeah, and as far as dogma is concerned, I think just surrounding yourself with people that you respect enough to challenge you, and people who disagree with you, who, this town that I live in is like, these people are from different generations, different economic backgrounds, have different political views, but at the same time, we're all saying, hey, I want to come together as a team and support each other in these communal ways, whether that's producing an event or working at a garden or being in a band or whatever the thing is. So that's huge. Like, to recognize that it's actually not about who you voted for president or, how much money you have, that we actually have a lot in common and can all work together toward common goals. And that just sort of helps you see the nuance in all things and all people, and makes it a lot more difficult to judge people, especially based on opinions. I'd much rather judge people based on their actions. Like, is this person generous and kind and capable of saying sorry and stepping up to the plate or being vulnerable? Like, those are the qualities of people I want to spend time with. And yeah.
How do you develop trust within a community? I find that it's much easier to listen to disagreement and critique from somebody that you deeply trust, because for me, I think I know the intention of that person, right? And they're disagreeing or critiquing not to hurt me, but because they want to share how they feel and they want what's best for me. How do you go about building that trust, and how do you process when those disagreements and critiques happen within a community environment?
That's a really hard question. I think my best answer to it so far is getting hurt, like screwing that up, actually, like trusting people and then getting hurt and learning from those mistakes on how much to share or how much to trust. I think I am a bit of an idealist when it comes to our capacity to live communally and in a way that supports one another and is open and communicative and emotionally intelligent. And like, I've projected that capacity onto far more people than I should have. So yeah, I think it all just goes back to discernment, like being realistic about people's capacities, being conscious of projections. And I sort of started to feel like I'm so desiring of this like mutually supportive community that I'm kind of a little drunk with longing, like similar to how we are when we're young and falling in love. Like, we don't make the best decisions when we're young if we just follow that sort of like goo goo gaga eyed feeling. And that's sort of how I felt about community. Like, oh, it's so easy, you can just do it. And it's like way harder than that, and requires a lot of humility and capacity to make mistakes and say you're sorry and walk away from people that can't do it. And so I don't know, I would say it's half discernment, half experience, half practice. And not everyone can be trusted, and that trust takes time, and actions are extremely important. And you can't learn those things unless you engage with people, right? In relationship, in like cooperative teams, and like I work for the paper where I am, and like I have this job of maintaining an objective, unbiased voice in the face of rumors and feelings and decades of history, and right, like it's not something you can talk about. It's something you really have to put yourself in. Like, okay, I'm not doing this community thing because it's like an easy thing. It's not like I'm taking a break. It's work. There's effort involved in living in a community and living communally. So yeah, and some people are dedicated to that. Some people have taken that on as a spiritual practice, and others have not. And so hopefully we can find other people that have really chosen that as we have, and really want to act from that place.
Yeah, that's great. That's very well said. I like to say, believe what people do, not what people say, but also with the caveat that people come with their own experiences and conditioning. So, not these steps are not always from not having the intention to live in a certain way, but from that conditioning that comes from different experiences. Right. Yeah. So wonderful. Last question. What do you do nowadays? How do you spend your days? But walk me through, what your life looks like in the middle of nowhere.
Well, like I said, I write for the paper, and at the moment we're in our deadline week. So, wrapping up writing what I need to write and getting recordings from town meetings. And, so I do a lot of writing. I've been writing, working on a book project. So spending a couple hours a day, hopefully, doing that, which is like a new thing that I'm taking on and committing to. The spring has officially arrived. So the 2 gardens I work at we're starting to plant and transplant and clean and dig up grass that does not want to be dug up. And I teach dance, so that happens sometimes. I go to other people's dance offerings or yoga, and a lot of cooking. I cook a lot of food for myself and my partner, and at the moment we're in the middle of a lot of construction. We're building a sort of like mudroom extra bathroom onto the front of our house, and have another property that we're working on creating a movement studio in. So there's a lot of machines and tile projects to manage, and sort of a lot of building and construction is taking up a fair bit of time. And I would say that's what my life looks like. And I'm helping this year quite a bit, an event here that's been happening for 35 years called the Crestone Energy Fair, which you were here for last year?
Yes.
Okay. That's when you came, right?
Yes.
So I sort of volunteered a little bit last year and helped with the green room, and have sort of taken on a more substantial role this year. I really wanted to redesign the website for the event because I felt like it needed an upgrade. And so I've signed on to do a lot more branding and content creation and website redesign, using my skills that I developed in the natural products industry to benefit my local community, which feels really great. And that's been a time-consuming project. It's a big team. It's a free event, so all the money that people make, either to come speak or to work the event, has to be, we accept donations and sponsorships and fundraising. So it's an effort to sustain the event in order to keep it free for participants. But it's a really fun event that focuses on like alternative and sustainable and regenerative building and construction and lifestyle. And which, if anyone is interested, is happening September 14th and 15th in Crestone, Colorado this year. And yeah, so that's been a lot of budget meetings and sponsorship meetings. And it's weird, like people say to me like, well, what do you do out there? Aren't you bored? And I'm more busy here than I feel like I've ever been, but it's a different quality of busy. You know, it feels nourishing, and like I can see tangible results of what I'm doing in a way that, yeah, just makes that kind of like, it wasn't actually the busyness that was the problem. It was more like the quality of it and its balance relative to my, self-care. So
because all of the values seem to be aligned with what you're doing, the values that you hold dear.
Yeah. And I think like, going back to this idea of hunter-gatherers, I don't feel like our nervous systems were built to consume, news and updates from billions of people and every place on the planet. It's an artificially created reality in that sense. And so while of course I care deeply about world issues, I think refocusing my efforts and my energy on what I can do in my backyard and for my community is, not maybe selfish, which is what the culture might tell us, but I think actually far more productive in, how do we world problems get created through, they start with interpersonal problems and they start with interpersonal traumas. Yeah, I think just that sort of local focus is quite calming.
Yeah, if we were all involved in our local communities, then, that takes care of it globally, right? Because everyone is in their corner of the world, and that doesn't mean we don't connect with other people outside of that community, but that primary focus is where we can make the most impact.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect, I think.
Yeah. Anya, thank you so much for
thank you.
This generous amount of time. Where can people find you if you want them to find you?
Well, I have a website, Anya Kaats, ANYAKAATS.com, and I'm on Instagram, ANYA.KAATS. And we have another account for our Crestone project up there on Instagram as well. Or come visit Crestone. It's a cool, funky place.
The Crestone Conglomerate, that's the name of the account?
Yeah, the Crestone Conglomerate. Yeah, there's a rock here that only exists here, a conglomerate rock called Crestone Conglomerate, sort of, a rock made of many other different rocks. And so we thought it was a good name for our project, the sort of metaphor of creating a home and a life and supportive whole made up of, lots of different weird black sheep from our lives. So that's the project. And I feel like I'm in a bit of a transition now, especially career-wise. Like after the podcast, I almost feel like I've sort of abandoned the idea of career. And like, what if I could just support myself and live a healthy whole life by sort of piecing different things together, whether that's saving money at gardens or making some money from the energy fair or the paper. And so kind of taking a much more holistic, approach to career. So I feel like my website and all these sort of online presence things become more and more difficult. Like I'm just a person living a life.
Isn't that what we all want? To be a person living a life, the life that we want to live.
Exactly.
Right? That's the ideal.
It's really that simple.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. Well, thank you so much again. And yeah, it's wonderful to share with the broader audience who, are interested in that perspective and that want to understand what else goes into this mix. It's not just food, it's not just water, it's not just one thing, is how we are meant to live in this world and what we can do from whatever place we are to take strides.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Ancestral Health Today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on how evolutionary insights can inform modern health practices. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast to catch future episodes.